The sea was black as tar, broken only by the faint shimmer of starlight glancing off the rolling swells. The night air was heavy, thick with the scent of salt and fuel oil, and somewhere out in that vast expanse of water, engines hummed low in the darkness. A U.S. Navy PT boat, a small, fast torpedo craft barely 80 feet in length, slid like a predator across the Sibuyan Sea. Her crew were tense and silent, eyes fixed on the horizon where faint silhouettes had begun to materialize. They were Japanese transports, plodding south toward Mindoro, carrying men, ammunition, and supplies meant to fortify an island the Americans intended to invade. The PT boat, barely visible against the ink-black surface, closed the gap. Every man on board knew that discovery would bring a storm of fire. They were outgunned by every ship in the convoy, but they carried with them the one advantage that mattered most: speed and surprise. The helmsman gripped the wheel, knuckles white, as the boat skipped over the waves. Sweat trickled down his neck despite the cool night air. Behind him, the 3 Packard engines roared quietly, throbbing like the heartbeat of a predator waiting to strike. The torpedo tubes gleamed dully in the dim red glow of the boat's interior lights. The order came in a whisper: "Stand by torpedoes." Every sailor held his breath. In the stillness, the convoy loomed closer, the bulky outlines of Japanese supply ships lumbering along, blissfully unaware of what stalked them in the dark. Then came the sharp crackle of gunfire, Japanese escorts probing the shadows with tracers. The PT crew knew it was now or never. With a shuddering hiss, the first torpedo streaked into the water. Moments later, the night erupted in fire and thunder. A Japanese freighter staggered under the impact, its midsection blossoming into orange flame. The sea roared with explosions, and in the glare of the inferno, sailors watched as another torpedo found its mark, tearing open the hull of a second ship. The silence of the Sibuyan Sea was gone, replaced by chaos. Tracers zipped across the water. Shells burst around the PT boat, and Japanese gunners desperately fired into the night at shadows that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The American crew darted away at flank speed, weaving through geysers of water as enemy shells slammed into the sea. Behind them, towering columns of fire marked the death of Japan's supply lifeline, their transports transformed into floating pyres. For the men aboard the PT boat, the sight was unforgettable, the orange glow dancing across the black water, the cries of the wounded fading into the night, and the knowledge that this was only the beginning of their campaign. Yet to understand the full weight of that moment, the torched convoys off Mindoro, we must step back and see the broader picture of a war teetering on the edge of climax. By late 1944, the Philippines had become the crucible of the Pacific War. General Douglas MacArthur had fulfilled his promise to return, beginning with landings at Leyte in October. The Japanese Empire, battered but unyielding, sought desperately to reinforce its garrisons across the archipelago. Supply lines stretched thin across thousands of miles of ocean, running from Formosa, Indochina, and the East Indies, and every ton of fuel or ammunition was precious. Mindoro, a rugged island south of Luzon, was vital to Japan's defense. Its capture would provide the Americans with airfields close enough to strike Manila and paralyze Japanese operations on Luzon. For Japan, the answer was simple but brutal. Keep those supply ships running, no matter the cost. Convoys were loaded with troops, crates of ammunition, barrels of fuel, and rice sacks meant to feed garrisons clinging to the last scraps of territory. But to move those convoys across seas dominated by American submarines, aircraft, and now PT boats was an act of desperation. The Japanese merchant fleet, once vast, had been reduced to shadows of its former power. Escorts were scarce, fuel shortages plagued every voyage, and the men sailing these convoys knew that survival was uncertain. Each trip was a gamble between starvation on land or fiery death at sea. For the Americans, the mission was clear: sever Japan's lifelines and isolate their strongholds. PT boats, often called the Mosquito Fleet, were small but vicious weapons ideally suited for these waters. Operating from hidden bases along the Philippine coast, they prowled like wolves, waiting for convoys to reveal themselves. They were not designed for slugging matches with destroyers or cruisers. Instead, they struck like daggers in the dark, quick, brutal, and always moving before the enemy could respond. It was not glamorous work. PT crews endured tropical heat, constant danger, and nights spent in nerve-wracking silence. But when the opportunity came, when the silhouettes of Japanese freighters appeared on the horizon, all the hardship melted away, replaced by the thrill of combat and the grim satisfaction of watching an enemy transport burn. The raid off Mindoro was not an isolated act of daring, but part of a wider campaign that reflected the changing nature of the Pacific War. The great naval clashes, Coral Sea, Midway, Leyte Gulf, had already broken the back of Japan's fleet. What remained was a war of attrition, a battle to starve the Japanese garrisons and choke their armies of fuel and ammunition. PT boats were one of the tools forged for this phase of war, weapons of speed and stealth that could deliver lethal strikes without engaging in prolonged battles. To the crews of these small craft, every burning Japanese ship was proof that the strategy worked. The flames of Mindoro, licking skyward as transports sank into the black water, symbolized more than just the destruction of supplies. They were the death knell of Japan's ability to sustain its war in the Philippines. Each convoy lost was another step toward isolation, another nail in the coffin of an empire that had once swept across Asia with unstoppable force. The men who witnessed those infernos, American sailors crouched behind gun shields, Japanese survivors clinging to burning wreckage, understood, even in that moment, that the Pacific War was entering its final, most desperate stage. From that night onward, the campaign for Mindoro would unfold with relentless momentum. The PT boats had proven their worth, and the Japanese convoys that survived knew they would never again sail unchallenged. The sea itself had become a battlefield, a place where small boats could alter the fate of entire campaigns. And as the last echoes of gunfire faded into the Philippine night, the flames still flickered on the horizon, a grim reminder that war's course had been set, and that the path forward would only grow more violent. The sea around Mindoro was deceptively calm in December of 1944. From the deck of a Japanese transport, a soldier leaned against the rail, staring toward the faint outline of the island rising in the distance. He could feel the weight of his rifle slung across his back, smell the sharp tang of diesel fumes from the engine room below, and taste the dryness of rice rations in his mouth. To him, Mindoro was more than a patch of jungle and mountains. It was the last line before Luzon, before Manila, before the empire itself was forced to retreat again. He did not know if his ship would make it through the gauntlet of submarines, aircraft, and small, fast American torpedo boats that prowled the waters. But he understood one thing. If Mindoro fell, Manila would be next, and with it, Japan's hopes of holding the Philippines. The island of Mindoro sat like a stepping stone in the Philippine archipelago, positioned southwest of Luzon and just across the Verde Island Passage from Manila Bay. Though less famous than Leyte or Iwo Jima, its geography gave it immense strategic weight. For the Americans, still fresh from their costly but triumphant return to Leyte, the capture of Mindoro offered a promise: flat terrain suitable for airfields, proximity to the capital, and a staging ground for the massive assault on Luzon. From Luzon, the liberation of the Philippines would unfold, fulfilling MacArthur's pledge to return and severing Japan's hold over Southeast Asia. For the Japanese, however, the picture was starkly different. Since 1942, they had poured men, materiel, and resources into the defense of the Philippines, believing that holding the islands meant holding the gateway to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and the rice of Indochina. Their supply lines, already stretched and vulnerable, funneled dwindling reserves of aviation fuel, ammunition, and food into Luzon through smaller, more exposed islands like Mindoro. Each convoy that sailed toward the Philippines carried not only supplies, but also the survival of tens of thousands of Japanese troops still fighting on the ground. The U.S. Navy knew this. After the victory at Leyte Gulf, American forces held the upper hand at sea and in the air, but control of the Philippines was not yet complete. Luzon remained a fortress bristling with Japanese defenders. To take it head-on without neutralizing nearby staging areas would invite disaster. Mindoro, with its underdeveloped infrastructure and smaller garrison, offered an opportunity. By seizing it quickly, the Americans could establish forward air bases capable of launching fighter and bomber sorties deep into Luzon, cutting Japanese reinforcements before they reached Manila. The terrain of the island was both a challenge and an advantage. Its northern regions were mountainous and covered in jungle, while the southern plains near San Jose provided ideal ground for constructing runways. Engineers who later surveyed the island noted that the soil was firm enough to support heavy bombers, and that the coastal approaches, though narrow, could accommodate amphibious landings if naval and aerial cover was sufficient. These practical details mattered as much as strategy, for without functioning airfields, the invasion of Luzon would be a leap into the unknown. But as American planners prepared their assault, the Japanese clung to their lifelines. By late 1944, Japan's merchant marine was a shadow of what it had been. Out of the 6 million tons of shipping available at the start of the war, barely 2 million remained afloat. Submarines had ravaged convoys from Formosa and the East Indies, and long-range American aircraft scoured the sea lanes. Yet still, convoys sailed, under the cover of night, through narrow straits, hugging coastlines to avoid detection. Each ship carried fuel in rusting drums, shells packed in wooden crates, sacks of rice, and weary troops who knew they might never reach their destination. For the Japanese High Command, Mindoro was a gamble they could not afford to lose. Every day the island remained in their hands was one more day to reinforce Luzon and prepare Manila for siege. Every convoy that survived the perilous run brought hope, no matter how fleeting. Admiral Soemu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, understood that naval power alone could not protect the Philippines. Instead, survival hinged on the courage of supply captains and the bravery of small escort ships, aging destroyers and converted patrol vessels, who faced overwhelming odds against submarines, aircraft, and PT boats. For the Americans, the gamble was equally high. If they could not neutralize Japanese supply lines into Luzon, the invasion would mean facing better-fed, better-supplied enemy troops in terrain that already favored the defenders. The lesson of previous campaigns loomed large. At Guadalcanal, Japan's Tokyo Express had funneled men and supplies under cover of night, prolonging the battle and nearly turning it into a stalemate. The U.S. could not allow a repeat of that costly delay. Every Japanese convoy destroyed off Mindoro meant fewer defenders on Luzon, fewer shells fired against American landing craft, and fewer kamikaze planes fueled to strike U.S. carriers. Logistics became the silent weapon of this campaign. Behind the PT boats and transports, an entire machinery of war moved relentlessly. In the United States, factories in Detroit and Chicago churned out aircraft engines and munitions. Liberty ships carried endless cargo across the Pacific. Fuel flowed from Texas oil fields to Pearl Harbor, then to forward bases across the Marianas and New Guinea. Against this tide of abundance, Japan had little left. Their refineries lay in ruins, their shipping industry crippled, their once proud navy reduced to scraps of steel and suicide missions. By 1944, Japanese soldiers on Luzon often subsisted on half rations, sometimes less, while American divisions arriving in the Philippines carried with them not only weapons, but crates of canned food, medical supplies, and fuel enough to sustain entire campaigns. The waters off Mindoro thus became more than just sea lanes. They were arteries of survival, each convoy a lifeline pumping blood into the body of Japan's shrinking empire. To the men aboard PT boats lurking in the dark, every silhouette on the horizon represented a chance to choke that lifeline. To the Japanese soldiers waiting in Manila, every delayed convoy meant another week of hunger, another shortage of ammunition, another sign that their empire was being starved into submission. The gamble was not only military, but political. General MacArthur's promise to liberate the Philippines was not just a matter of honor. It was a statement to America's allies and to the Filipino people. Abandoning the islands to prolonged occupation would have undermined U.S. credibility in Asia. At the same time, Tokyo's leaders, desperate to hold the Philippines, saw Mindoro as a symbolic barrier. If they could prevent the Americans from establishing airfields there, they could delay the inevitable confrontation over Luzon and perhaps wring some concession through negotiation. As convoys sailed and PT boats prowled, the stage was set for a clash in which small vessels and desperate measures would have outsized consequences. The battle for Mindoro was not just about landings on a jungle island. It was about control of the lifelines that sustained armies and determined the fate of nations. In the darkness of those waters, every burning freighter, every sunken transport, every torpedo launched in silence carried weight far beyond the horizon. The strategic gamble at Mindoro was now in motion, and the fires that soon lit the night would decide not only the future of the Philippines, but also the speed with which the Pacific War raced toward its bloody conclusion. Spray lashed against the bow as the small craft shuddered forward, its hull vibrating under the strain of 3 roaring engines. The helmsman squinted through the night, gripping the wheel with both hands as the boat skipped across the swells at 40 knots, its wake glowing faintly in the starlight. The vessel was no larger than a fishing boat, built of wood and light enough to burn in an instant, but on its deck sat torpedoes capable of tearing open the side of a cruiser. The men aboard were not shielded by armor. Instead, they relied on speed, daring, and the hope that their strike would be swift enough to vanish before enemy guns could find their mark. To the crews who manned them, these were not fragile plywood boats, but predators, mosquitoes of the sea, built to sting and disappear into the darkness. The patrol torpedo boat, PT for short, was born out of a vision that seemed reckless when first proposed. In the 1930s, as battleships still dominated naval doctrine and aircraft carriers were only beginning to prove their worth, a handful of naval thinkers considered the possibilities of speed over armor. Rather than building ships to absorb punishment, why not create vessels that avoided it altogether? The idea was not new. During the First World War, small torpedo craft had darted at larger ships with mixed results, and European navies, particularly the Italians and British, had experimented with motor torpedo boats in the interwar years. Yet the U.S. Navy, steeped in the traditions of steel and gunnery, had been slow to adopt the concept. By 1940, however, with war on the horizon, the idea gained traction. The Navy called for designs of small, fast attack craft that could patrol coastlines, intercept enemy barges, and ambush larger ships under cover of darkness. Contracts went out to several firms, and what followed was a race of ingenuity. The winning formula came not from a massive shipyard, but from smaller boat builders like Elco and Higgins Industries, who adapted pleasure craft and racing boat designs into war machines. Their creations were light, made primarily of laminated plywood, and powered by the thunder of Packard engines. These engines were marvels of engineering. Derived from aircraft power plants, each Packard Vi-12 marine engine delivered 1,200 horsepower. With 3 mounted side by side, a PT boat could surge to speeds over 40 knots, nearly 50 miles per hour, making them some of the fastest naval vessels of the war. But speed came at a price. The boats had little armor, no heavy guns, and hulls that could not withstand even small-caliber fire. A single well-aimed shell could reduce them to splinters. Survival depended on never being where the enemy expected, on dashing in for the kill and fleeing before return fire could catch up. Their weapon was the torpedo, at first the unreliable Mark 8, a carryover from World War I, and later the improved Mark 13, which had been redesigned for air and surface use. Mounted in tubes or on roll-off racks along the deck, these weapons were capable of sinking destroyers and transports alike. Crews also mounted machine guns, 20mm cannons, and eventually even heavier weapons like 37mm and 40mm guns scavenged from downed aircraft or friendly bases. Each PT boat was a constantly evolving experiment in lethality, modified by its crew to suit the conditions they faced. But doctrine could not be forged in shipyards alone. It had to be tested in battle. The PT boats entered the crucible of war in the South Pacific, where the vast distances and isolated outposts of the Solomon Islands gave them their first proving grounds. At Guadalcanal, the boats were thrown into night battles against the Japanese Tokyo Express, fast destroyers ferrying troops and supplies under cover of darkness. The results were mixed. Inexperienced crews struggled to aim torpedoes in the chaos of battle, and faulty weapons often ran too deep or failed to detonate. Many missions ended with PT boats forced to retreat under heavy fire, their wooden hulls riddled with shrapnel. Casualties were high, and critics wondered if the Mosquito fleet had been an expensive experiment doomed to failure. Yet in those dark nights of failure came hard-won lessons. Crews learned to coordinate their attacks, fanning out across the approaches to likely routes and striking from multiple angles. Radar, still a new technology, gave them an edge in locating convoys before they themselves were spotted. Tactics improved. Instead of charging recklessly at destroyers, PT boats shifted to targeting barges, small craft, and transports, the lifeblood of Japan's scattered island garrisons. Against these softer targets, their torpedoes and cannons wreaked havoc. Perhaps the most enduring proof of their value came not from victories at sea, but from the men who fought aboard them. PT crews were often young, barely out of their teens, drawn to the glamour of serving on fast attack craft. They endured sweltering heat, constant danger, and long hours of nerve-wracking patrols in the dark. Their camaraderie became their armor, their belief in speed and surprise their only shield. For many, the PT boat was not just a weapon, but a symbol of audacity, a chance for small groups of men to tip the scales in a vast ocean war. By late 1943 and into 1944, the boats had carved a reputation as raiders of the night. In the Solomons, in New Guinea, and across the Bismarck Sea, PT squadrons shredded Japanese barge traffic, strangling supply lines and starving garrisons into irrelevance. They rescued downed pilots, ferried commandos, and even conducted reconnaissance in waters too shallow for larger ships. Slowly, the doctrine of speed over armor, once dismissed as reckless, proved itself indispensable. By the time the campaign for the Philippines began, the Mosquito fleet was no longer an experiment, but a sharpened blade. Dozens of squadrons operated from hidden coves and forward bases, their crews hardened by years of night combat. Their boats carried heavier armament, their torpedoes had been improved, and their commanders understood the art of striking convoys with precision and vanishing before dawn. Against an enemy already stretched thin and desperate to resupply its garrisons, PT boats became a terror, always waiting, always watching, and always ready to turn a dark horizon into an inferno. And so, when the waters around Mindoro filled with Japanese supply ships, it was these small hunters, evolved through trial and sacrifice, that slipped into the night to deliver America's sting. The doctrine of speed, born in plywood and fire, was now ready to unleash havoc on Japan's fading empire. The jungle was alive with sound. Cicadas shrieked in the humid night, and the rustling of palm fronds carried on the breeze, masking the mechanical growl of engines being coaxed back to life. In a small cove on the Philippine coast, a squadron of PT boats lay hidden, their dark silhouettes blending with the mangroves. Makeshift piers jutted into the water, built from logs and scrap planks hammered together by seabees and sailors. On shore, canvas tents sagged under the constant rain, and oil drums were stacked like barricades around the camp. The men lived in perpetual discomfort, mosquitoes, mud, and the acrid stench of gasoline clinging to everything. But to them, this cove was home, the place from which they launched their nightly hunts into enemy waters. Every evening, the same ritual unfolded. Mechanics crawled over engines still hot from the previous night's patrol, patching bullet holes in the thin wooden hulls, replacing spark plugs, and wiping salt spray from the torpedo racks. Sailors cleaned machine guns and stacked ammunition belts while officers spread out charts under lantern light, tracing the likely routes of Japanese convoys. There was no glamour here, only the grinding routine of preparation. At dusk, the boats slipped out in silence, skimming over the black water like shadows, their wakes dissolving into the night. The men aboard carried only what they needed: a pistol in a holster, a helmet perched beside the gun mount, a life jacket often ignored. They knew that if a shell struck home, the plywood hull would splinter like matchsticks, and survival would depend on swimming toward the faint outline of jungle miles away. Operating in the Philippines was unlike the earlier campaigns in the Solomons or New Guinea. Here, the stakes were higher, the waters more crowded, and the enemy more desperate. Japanese convoys, once shielded by destroyers and cruisers, now crept through narrow straits under cover of darkness, relying on speed and stealth to avoid detection. PT squadrons mirrored this behavior, lying in wait near choke points, passages between islands, entrances to bays, and river mouths. There, in the hours before dawn, battles played out in bursts of fire and thunder before silence reclaimed the sea. Yet convoy attacks were only part of their mission. PT boats became the Swiss Army knives of the fleet. When aircraft were downed over jungle or sea, PT crews were often the first to arrive, hauling battered pilots aboard and racing them back to safety under threat of enemy air patrols. On other nights, the boats slipped close to shore, landing scouts or Filipino guerrillas who vanished into the foliage with radios and weapons. Sometimes they prowled shallow waters, intercepting barges loaded with Japanese troops or supplies. Against these unarmored craft, the PT boats' machine guns and cannons tore through wood and flesh alike, leaving trails of wreckage behind. Every patrol carried the tension of uncertainty. The jungle coastlines were riddled with Japanese observation posts, and even the glow of a cigarette could give away a position. Radar sets, though invaluable, were primitive and prone to malfunction. The enemy's response could come without warning: a sudden flash of searchlights, the thud of coastal batteries firing from hidden emplacements, or the growl of aircraft engines overhead. More than one PT boat was caught in the glare of a spotlight, forced to weave frantically through geysers of water as Japanese shells bracketed their path. Survivors later remembered the surreal mix of beauty and terror: the phosphorescent spray glittering under tracers, the roar of Packard engines straining for every ounce of speed, and the desperate prayers whispered as wooden decks shook with near misses. Life at the forward bases was as unforgiving as the missions. Food arrived irregularly, often in the form of canned rations that grew monotonous. Tropical diseases stalked the camps: malaria, dysentery, and skin infections that turned minor cuts into festering wounds. Sleep was scarce, often interrupted by air raids or the grinding labor of repairing boats battered by combat. Yet morale was kept alive by the very danger that haunted them. The men knew they were part of something vital. Every Japanese barge destroyed, every convoy disrupted, every pilot rescued fed into the larger tide of the campaign. They measured their victories not in territory gained, but in the knowledge that each strike hastened Japan's collapse. The technical challenge of keeping PT boats operational in such conditions was immense. Their wooden hulls swelled and warped in the humid climate, demanding constant maintenance. Fuel supplies were precious, and each sortie required careful rationing of the high-octane gasoline that gave the Packard engines their bite. Spare parts were scarce, forcing crews to improvise, cannibalizing wrecked boats, fashioning makeshift repairs with scrap metal, or even crafting replacement pieces by hand. In the Philippines, ingenuity was as important as courage. Without it, The Mosquito fleet would have withered in the jungle before ever reaching the open sea. By late 1944, Japanese sailors had come to fear the very mention of PT boats. They nicknamed them devil boats, whispering stories of convoys torn apart by invisible attackers who appeared without warning and vanished just as quickly. Survivors spoke of transports erupting into fireballs, of comrades dragged into burning seas, of the helplessness of watching supplies sink beneath the waves. The truth was that the Mosquito fleet, though small in size, had achieved a psychological dominance disproportionate to its numbers. For every Japanese captain guiding a convoy through narrow channels, the possibility of a torpedo strike haunted his thoughts, eroding confidence even before the first shot was fired. But the Americans paid their own price. Boats were lost, crews never returned, and those who survived carried the scars of their nightly duels, burns, shrapnel wounds, and memories of comrades lost in sudden flashes of fire. Yet even in tragedy, the men pressed forward. The rhythm of raids, repairs, and restless nights never ended. As one squadron commander later recalled, "We lived by the engines and died by the engines. They were our only chance of life." The deployment of PT boats in the Philippines was more than an extension of earlier campaigns. It was a crucible in which their doctrine matured fully. No longer were they mere experiments or supporting tools. They became predators that bled Japan's forces dry, one convoy at a time. The jungle bases, the sleepless nights, the improvised repairs, and the desperate ambushes all combined into a pattern of relentless pressure, a constant menace gnawing at the lifeblood of an empire already in retreat. And as the months wore on, the crews of the Mosquito fleet knew one truth above all. Their war was not decided in grand battleships or towering carriers, but in the hidden coves and black waters where speed, courage, and persistence determined who lived and who burned. The sea was black as obsidian on the December nights of 1944, the kind of darkness where horizon and sky bled together into a single void. In that vast emptiness, a Japanese convoy crept southward, its wakes muffled under the shroud of night. Transports and freighters, heavy with ammunition, fuel, and soldiers destined for Luzon, moved cautiously through the waters off Mindoro. Their decks were crowded with weary men, rifles stacked near the bulkheads, their eyes darting nervously toward the shoreline they could not see. Escorts plowed the edges of the column, their lookouts scanning the Black Sea, knowing that danger lurked where silence was deepest. Unbeknownst to them, danger was already there. Waiting in ambush were squadrons of American PT boats, scattered like wolves along the convoy's expected route. In the hours before midnight, they had slipped out of their hidden coves, their Packard engines throttled down to a low growl, their crews crouched in readiness. Torpedoes gleamed in their racks, machine guns were fed with belts of tracer rounds, and eyes strained through binoculars, watching for the first hint of silhouettes against the starlit horizon. The PT men were veterans by now, blooded in the Solomons and hardened in New Guinea. They knew that the convoy they were about to attack carried more than cargo. It carried Japan's last hope of reinforcing Luzon before the American tide swept ashore. The first sighting came just after midnight. Shapes emerged, ghost-like, the bulk of freighters and transports gliding across the dark water. At the signal, the PT boats began their deadly dance, fanning out into attack formation. Engines roared as throttles were shoved forward, the light craft skipping across waves at 40 knots. Japanese lookouts, startled by the sudden thunder, scrambled to alert their gunners, but it was already too late. Torpedoes slashed into the sea, streaking white wakes toward their targets. Seconds stretched into eternity as the PT crews watched, waiting for the telltale flash. Then came the first explosion. An ammunition ship shuddered as fire burst skyward, its holds igniting like a volcano. The shockwave rippled across the convoy, knocking men off their feet and showering debris into the night. Another detonation followed as a second freighter was struck amidships, a gaping wound torn open in its hull. Flames rose high into the air, lighting the sea with an orange glow that banished the darkness for miles around. Chaos engulfed the convoy. Japanese escorts opened fire wildly, tracer rounds stitching the night, desperate to hit shadows darting too fast to track. Shells whistled over the water, bursting in geysers around the speeding PT boats. Crews crouched low as splinters of steel and seawater rained down, but their helmsmen twisted and weaved, evading by instinct. The boats answered with their own fire. 20mm cannons rattled, machine guns barked, their tracers slicing into Japanese barges and transports, raking decks crowded with men. Survivors would later describe the horror. Soldiers trapped aboard burning transports screamed as flames licked across oil-slicked decks. Some leapt into the water only to be swallowed by fire floating across the surface. Ammunition stored below ignited in deadly cascades, shells cooking off with deafening cracks, turning ships into floating infernos. From a distance, it looked as though the entire sea itself was on fire. For the Americans, the ambush was executed with ruthless precision. PT-223, one of the lead boats, scored a direct hit on a freighter carrying barrels of aviation fuel. Within moments, the ship was engulfed in a column of flame that reached into the sky like a beacon, visible even to air crews miles away. Another PT crew launched a torpedo at a transport packed with soldiers, and when it struck, the vessel split in two, bodies and debris hurled into the churning surf. Reports from after the battle noted that some ships sank in less than 5 minutes, giving their crews no chance of survival. Yet victory was never without risk. PT-293 found itself illuminated by a Japanese searchlight, its silhouette exposed to gunners aboard an escorting destroyer. Shells ripped through the water around it, one tearing into the aft section and killing a machinist instantly. The helmsman pushed the throttles wide open, engines screaming as the boat darted away, zigzagging until the beams of light fell back into darkness. The crew would later patch the hole with scrap lumber and return to duty, grimly aware of how close they had come to annihilation. The ambush lasted less than an hour, but to those who fought, it stretched into a lifetime. By dawn, the sea off Mindoro was littered with wreckage, smoking hulks drifting aimlessly, lifeboats overturned, oil and fire spreading across the waves. The Japanese convoy had been shattered. Several transports and freighters lay sunk or burning, their precious cargo gone to the depths. Survivors clung to debris, their faces illuminated by the flames of their own ships, while PT boats slipped back into the night, their mission complete. American after-action reports painted the engagement as a triumph of speed and surprise. Dozens of supply ships meant to reinforce Luzon never arrived, their men and materiel lost in the dark waters. For the Japanese, the ambush was a disaster, one more cut in the slow strangulation of their forces in the Philippines. Testimonies from prisoners captured later revealed the despair that spread through their ranks. Soldiers on Luzon, already short on rations and ammunition, would wait in vain for the convoys that never came. What lingered longest, however, was the sight of the sea on fire. Veterans of the Mosquito Fleet never forgot the glow that turned night into day, the thunder of torpedoes finding their mark, and the knowledge that in those burning waters, an empire's lifelines had been severed. The ambush off Mindoro was not the largest battle of the Pacific, nor the most famous, but to those who watched convoys vanish in flame, it was proof that small boats and daring men could alter the fate of a campaign. And as the flames flickered into dawn, the war pressed on, with the Mosquito Fleet already preparing for the next night's hunt. The sea around Luzon burned with memory. For Japanese sailors who survived the infernos of Mindoro, the image was seared into their minds. Black water turned orange by towering flames, comrades screaming from oil-slicked decks, and the choking stench of fuel igniting in the dark. Each convoy destroyed was not just a tactical loss, it was another coffin nail hammered into the empire's last defense in the Philippines. Yet even as the waters grew more dangerous, orders from Tokyo were unrelenting. Supplies had to reach Luzon, no matter the cost. If ships could not sail safely, then they would sail under the protection of desperation itself. By late December 1944, the Japanese response to the Mosquito fleet had begun to evolve into a grim mixture of improvisation and sacrifice. Convoys were no longer dispatched without air cover. Fighter patrols buzzed the sea lanes at dawn and dusk, straining to catch PT boats slinking back to their coves. Pilots were instructed to strafe on sight, their machine guns raking the waves where the wooden craft fled at full throttle. Yet for every PT boat caught in the open, another survived to strike again. Wooden hulls, nearly invisible on radar, slipped under clouds and moonless skies, defeating the eyes of airmen already stretched thin, defending Manila from American bombers. When air patrols proved insufficient, Japanese commanders turned to their newest and most terrible weapon, the kamikaze. At first, these suicide missions were directed against American carriers and troop ships, but as convoys grew more vulnerable, planners considered using them even against the Mosquito fleet. It was a strategy born of futility. Pilots, barely trained, were ordered into obsolete aircraft loaded with explosives, instructed to dive on anything they could find in the coastal waters. For PT crews, the sight was surreal, planes plummeting toward tiny wooden boats, missing more often than not, smashing instead into the shallows or jungle shoreline. On the rare occasion a kamikaze struck near its target, the blast shredded planks and splinters, leaving survivors clinging to wreckage in seas already littered with debris. But kamikazes could not be everywhere, and the convoys still needed closer protection. To fill the gap, Japan deployed armed barges, shallow draft vessels originally intended for transport, now bristling with makeshift guns. Their task was simple: to serve as moving shields, to intercept PT boats long enough for transports to slip away. These barges were slow, often cobbled together from whatever steel remained, and they fared poorly against the speed and firepower of the Mosquito fleet. American sailors remembered the firefights vividly. Bursts of machine gun fire cracking across narrow channels, the silhouettes of barges erupting in sparks as tracers chewed through their hulls. Some barges sank quickly, others burned stubbornly, their crews refusing to abandon ship even as flames consumed the deck. For the Japanese, even these small floating fortresses were symbols of resistance, bought with blood and futility. Survivor accounts paint the desperation clearly. A sailor from a transport sunk off Batangas later recalled the moment torpedoes tore through his ship. He had watched as escorts turned their guns outward, firing blindly at the sea, while barges attempted to ram the PT boats darting between them. The American craft were too fast, their engines screaming like banshees, their torpedoes already loosed before Japanese gunners could adjust. In his words, "We fought the night itself, and the night always won." He clung to driftwood until dawn, watching his comrades vanish beneath the waves, knowing that the supplies meant for Luzon were gone forever. The larger picture was even grimmer. By January 1945, Japanese shipping losses in the Philippines reached catastrophic levels. Convoys that once carried thousands of tons of cargo now delivered only a fraction, if they arrived at all. Ammunition depots ran dry, fuel reserves shrank to nothing, and frontline soldiers on Luzon reported receiving only handfuls of rice each day. Japanese commanders begged for reinforcements, but Tokyo could offer only words. The empire's merchant fleet, already decimated by American submarines and bombers, was being bled to extinction by swarms of PT boats. Each loss deepened the imbalance. The Americans drew strength from vast industrial reserves, while the Japanese dwindled into starvation. Still, counterstrokes continued. Naval officers ordered convoys to sail under heavier escort, risking the few destroyers left in their arsenal. Some captains experimented with decoys, lighting fires on rafts to lure PT torpedoes, or running convoys closer to shore under the protection of coastal batteries. In practice, these measures offered little salvation. American radar and reconnaissance aircraft tracked convoys with precision, guiding PT squadrons to their prey. When barges tried to shield transports, they were annihilated in running battles. When destroyers joined the convoys, they often arrived too late, drawn into fruitless chases as torpedoes struck their charges and left them burning. Every Japanese countermeasure revealed the widening gulf between the two powers. Where America could afford to experiment, adapt, and replace losses, Japan was forced into gambles of desperation. Kamikazes, barges, and escorts all drained resources that were already vanishing. The imbalance was no longer just tactical, it was existential. For every freighter sunk off Mindoro, an entire regiment on Luzon went without supplies. For every tanker destroyed, squadrons of aircraft were grounded, their fuel tanks bone dry. The fury of Japan's counterstroke, no matter how courageous, could not reverse the tide. And yet, for the men who fought under the rising sun, despair was not permission to surrender. They sailed knowing their chances of return were slim, that the sea might become their grave. Survivors of the convoys spoke of comrades singing songs on deck before battle, of captains bowing to their crews as torpedoes approached, of last messages scrawled in notebooks before ships erupted in fire. It was a defiance forged in the knowledge that their empire was slipping away, one burning convoy at a time. The Mosquito fleet had forced Japan into a corner, and from that corner came acts of desperation, fury unleashed in the skies and seas. But fury could not fill empty supply lines. Desperation could not build new ships, and as each counterstroke faltered, it became clear that Japan's war in the Philippines was collapsing not with a single decisive blow, but with the relentless bleeding of lifelines severed night after night. The beaches of Mindoro echoed with the sound of boots striking sand. On December 15, 1944, American assault waves surged ashore under the cover of naval gunfire and aircraft overhead. The landing, though contested by scattered resistance, met nothing like the scale of opposition encountered at Leyte. Japanese defenders, already weakened and undersupplied, could do little more than harass the invaders. Inland, engineers wasted no time. Bulldozers and graders pushed through palm groves, flattening ground for runways. Within weeks, airfields stretched across the island, their steel matting shimmering under the Philippine sun. From these strips, American fighters and bombers could now reach Luzon itself, striking at Manila, Clark Field, and the arteries of Japanese resistance with relentless regularity. For the Japanese soldiers holding positions on Luzon, the loss of Mindoro was a catastrophe hidden inside silence. Convoys meant to deliver food and ammunition never arrived. Men dug foxholes deeper, not out of discipline, but because their bodies grew weaker by the day. Rice rations were cut to half, then to handfuls, and some units were forced to forage in jungles that yielded little more than roots and bitter greens. Ammunition shortages grew so dire that entire battalions rationed bullets, saving them only for the decisive moment. Artillery crews sat by silent guns, their shells expended, their barrels cold. The garrisons, once proud defenders of the empire, were transformed into isolated, starving remnants, watching the skies fill with American aircraft that came and went without opposition. The interdiction of convoys by PT boats and submarines turned the Japanese defense into a hollow shell. Each ship lost off Mindoro was more than timber and steel. It was the lifeblood of the front. A single freighter might carry fuel for dozens of aircraft, shells for hundreds of artillery pieces, or rations for thousands of soldiers. When those ships erupted in flames, the impact cascaded across the battlefield. By January 1945, American commanders noted that resistance on Luzon, though fierce in pockets, lacked coordination and strength. The Japanese fought with desperation, but not with supply. Their empire's arteries had been cut, and the body was beginning to wither. The momentum of the American offensive accelerated. With airfields on Mindoro active, the invasion of Luzon became not just possible, but inevitable. B-25 bombers lifted off daily, their bomb bays packed with explosives that rained down on Japanese concentrations and supply depots. Fighter squadrons swept ahead of convoys, protecting landing craft and harassing Japanese shipping that dared to move in daylight. The once formidable Japanese defense perimeter in the Philippines was crumbling, not through a single decisive battle, but through the slow starvation of its lifelines. The torching of convoys off Mindoro had set in motion consequences that stretched beyond the island itself. It sealed the fate of Japanese garrisons across the Philippines, accelerated the timetable of American offensives, and revealed the brutal truth of modern war. Control of the sea determined control of the land, and as the flames of sunken convoys flickered into memory, the road to Manila lay open, with Japan's retreat already written in the smoke above the waves. The roar of the Packard engines still echoed in the memories of the men who served aboard the Mosquito fleet. Decades later, veterans spoke of the nights when the sea turned to fire, when tracer rounds cut across the darkness like threads of light, and when torpedoes streaked toward hulking silhouettes many times their size. They remembered the smell of burning oil, the crack of splintering wood, and the desperate scramble to reload guns as enemy fire rained down around them. Above all, they remembered the silence that followed victory, the hum of engines throttling back, the wind in their ears, and the glow of flames flickering on the horizon, proof that their tiny craft had once again struck giants. In the grand histories of the Pacific War, PT boats were often overshadowed by carriers that launched hundreds of planes, or by battleships whose guns could flatten entire shorelines. Yet in the waters of the Philippines, their role was undeniable. These small, fragile craft had helped choke the arteries of an empire, slicing through convoys that carried the supplies Japan needed most. They were hunters of the night, disrupting enemy logistics at precisely the moment when the Philippines campaign hung in the balance. Though they lacked the grandeur of fleet actions, their victories were measured in starving garrisons, silenced artillery, and airfields that stood empty for lack of fuel. The legacy of the Mosquito fleet lay not only in their tactical successes, but in the courage of the men who sailed them. Crews of 10 to 15 men lived and fought as families, their survival tied to one another's instincts and resolve. They faced the knowledge that their boats could not take punishment. One direct hit could reduce them to wreckage, and yet they went out night after night, engines screaming at 40 knots, skimming dangerously close to enemy convoys, daring the impossible. Their stories became reminders that warfare was not always decided by the largest guns, but by speed, daring, and the refusal to yield in the face of overwhelming odds. When the war ended, many of the PT boats were scrapped, their plywood hulls burned or broken apart, their engines silenced forever. But the men who had crewed them carried their memory forward. Reunions years later were filled with tales of the Philippines, of ambushes near Mindoro, of comrades lost and victories won. They spoke of the relentless exhaustion, the suffocating heat, the terror of being caught in searchlights, and the exhilaration of escaping with the sea itself as their shield. For them, the PT boat was not merely a vessel, but a symbol of audacity, proof that courage could amplify even the smallest weapon into something decisive. The lessons of the Mosquito fleet endure. In an age when naval warfare was dominated by massive fleets and industrial power, these tiny boats revealed the vulnerability of supply chains. They showed that victory could hinge not only on decisive battles, but also on the steady erosion of an enemy's ability to fight, achieved by fast-moving raiders striking where defenses were weakest. Their campaigns foreshadowed modern naval doctrine, where speed, disruption, and asymmetry remain as vital as raw firepower. As the flames of Mindoro and the wider Philippine campaign faded into history, one truth remained etched in the story of the PT boats. War is not always won by giants. Sometimes it is decided by mosquitoes, small, relentless, and fearless, who sting until even the mightiest foe collapses.